Hi, and welcome to our session on cultural change for accelerated digital transformation at reInvent 2021. I'm Liam Maxwell. I'm the Director of Government Transformation at AWS, and my job is to lead a team that helps senior leaders and government and public service accelerate their transformation and modernization programs. The pandemic that we've just been through put enormous pressure on governments to deliver for the people. They had to build brand new systems at unprecedented speed and scale. And it turned out that governments can really move fast. And so I'm delighted today to be joined by two of the leaders in reforming governments who led that change and who helped put in place the components for change at great speed. They are Aaron Snow and Shaili Spiegelman. Aaron was the CEO of the Canadian Digital Service, and Shaili was DG in the Ministry of Science and Technology in Israel. Welcome to you both. Great to have you here.
Hi, Liam. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, Liam. Hey, Shaili.
Now, we've known each other for some time, and one of the things that we've always talked about is how government can become responsive and change under massive pressure. And we've talked a little bit about the enormous change that the pandemic brought about and how we needed to move at great speed, but also at great scale. And the big difference between public services and the commercial industry is that we work at enormous scale within our country. Nation scale is the required because government is for everybody. So in your roles and in your jobs, I'd really like to hear how you responded to that massive pressure of the pandemic, and what was it like to be in the hot seat? I'm going to go to you, Shaili, first. Israel, we know, topped the international table for vaccination, but could you take us through how that actually worked and what the components for it made it work?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Well, I can talk forever about the vaccination and the COVID, so I'll try to be very brief. And if I need to think about what actually made it work, I can think about three things. It's infrastructure, data, and innovation. I will say a little information about each of them. As you all can imagine, the COVID-19 changed everything in a country level, and we had to work very fast with very limited data. So on one hand, we wanted to use data to have better decision making, but the data was very real-time data. We didn't have a long-term data because it was every day there is a new data and new information. And we in that we're under a crisis mode. So how do you make decision based on that? So we did a few things that I want to mention. First, we built a Corona Lake, a big database with clinical information from all our HMOs and hospitals. It was set up in the Ministry of Health. We also had daily information about side effects of vaccination, who got vaccinated, who got infected, who got COVID from the fluent from the entire country. And we used that database or that data lake for a lot of research, real-time research, long-term, mid-term, to make better decision-making. For example, should we vaccinate pregnant women? Should we vaccinate kids? So we use all that data, and I'm sure you know that even the FDA and other countries use the Israeli data because of the small size of the country, we were able to have the vaccination pretty fast, pretty scale. So we use that data to make decision making. So that's one thing. The other thing is about the infrastructure. We had a very good infrastructure country-wise, the HMOs, the spread, and that helped us, in a very, very short time, had a lot of people vaccinated relative to other countries. The last thing I want to say at this point, and I have a lot of other examples, is about innovations. And that had two ways of thinking of it. First is that we try to be as creative as we can. For example, countries were debating whether to vaccinate specific segments like 60 plus or vaccinate everybody who wants to vaccinate, so we do it very fast. Israel actually chose to do both. So in the morning, we until, 7 or 8 p.m., we vaccinated the 60 plus, the teachers, the doctors, the specific segments. But then we said, okay, from 8 onwards, if we keep the vaccinations, they will get ruined, right? So we invited everyone who wants to come from 8 p.m. onwards to come and get vaccinated for the leftovers from the day vaccination. So that's kind of, thinking out of the box, thinking that helped. The other thing that was very effective, and you all know, Israel is the startup nation or the scale-up nation, depends how you call it. But we used a lot of what was very emotional and very exciting, that at least in the first and second wave, everybody stopped doing their day job and came to the government and say, all the startups, all the technology people, hey, how can we help? And we used a lot of that innovation and technology to accelerate vaccination, to accelerate tests, to use telemedicine, to use data research. And for example, a company like MDClone for synthetic data and a company like Healthy.il for remote urine tests. So we did using a lot of the technology and startups in Israel to help us, in our very, very difficult crisis mode work. So just to summarize, using the current infrastructure, using a lot of data and research, and exploiting the Israeli innovation to have everything going on.
There's two things there I wouldn't mind teasing out a little bit, Charlie, which is number one, the preparation, the having the infrastructure and the approach of using secure, scalable infrastructure really helped. The second side of it was, and where you're talking there about startups and scale-ups, is that you're not really thinking about a product you're actually looking at capabilities, and people were coming to you with the ability to say, I've got a capability for you. Come and use my capability. And really that's because you've got the structure, because you're starting to use the cloud, it means you can start to think of things as capabilities you can plug in and therefore move much faster. That's quite a big change for a government to start thinking in that way.
Yeah, that's totally true. As you know, we worked together for many years. Israel started their digital transformation work probably about 6 or 7 years ago, doing a lot of work on going to the cloud, but also about digital services and working with the industry and all of that. So in terms of also healthcare and education, but also government services and welfare and everything. And then once we had a crisis mode, we had all the platforms, we had the right people in place. We had the right infrastructure, we had the right technology platforms that we can then use, and that's what, in a very quick way, we could turn them into helping us dealing with this crisis. And as you said, the startup nation or the technology company, it was exactly that. We had 7 different companies that were building respirators. That's not their day job. The company was doing totally different, something different. But then when that's what they need, they did the rethink of their product and came with their offer how they can help the government. It was, once in a lifetime experience.
Yeah, and that's also as we start to think about this, and for our colleagues here who are at a conference, I mean, the conference is called reInvent. And so that's one of the things that I found really interesting about your remarks, is that you had businesses that had to reinvent themselves, and government reinvented itself as well as a data lake, as an organization where you started to use data to make policy decisions. Goodness, we've been saying that for years. Wouldn't that be great? But it actually started to happen live, and this was the forcing function for it. Aaron, can I come to you for a second, because Canada also stood out as a really clear leader in the response, and perhaps you could explain a little bit about the way that the Canada started to work.
Sure. Thanks, Liam. Hey, hi, folks. So yeah, 3 examples that come to mind, and all having all good examples, I think, of government culture and being able to think differently about how we work made a difference. The biggest one, the first one that comes to mind is the delivery of the Canada Emergency Relief Benefit right in the opening weeks of the pandemic in March and April of 2020. Those are so the Canada Revenue Agency and ESDC, the big benefits department, worked together early on, and were very, very quickly able to pump out billions of dollars in emergency relief payments. Normally, getting something that big and pushing out money to tens of millions of people would take a long time and be a fairly complex effort. But in the exigencies of the pandemic, the government was able to think very differently about the calculus between how careful they need to be about sending money out versus the exigency of getting money out and worrying later maybe about that sort of thing. So they were able to accomplish that in only a few weeks. So the second one I would think about is COVID Alert, which was the exposure notification system app and service that CDS, the Canadian Digital Service, was delivered in a matter of weeks. Typically, that's the kind of thing where a government would probably farm that out to one or multiple vendors. And in this particular case, CDS was able to step up and say, look, we actually have the capacity in-house to do this sort of thing. And this is the kind of thing where in a very high trust space where trust is important, security is important, folks believing in government protecting their privacy is important, that we actually think this should be done in-house, and we think that it should be done open source, and that all the work should be in the open. And so CDS was actually given, a fair amount of space to get that done in a very short time. Not necessarily working the way that a project like that might typically roll out. The last one I would just note is, and I think this happened in a lot of places, was for years, government had been talking about, how much effort it would be and how long it would take to make it possible for folks to work from home in government. And if you asked before the pandemic how long that would take and how possible it was, you'd get estimates in the years. But in the exigencies of the pandemic and in the moment, Shared Services Canada and the rest of government, managed to get the government there in a matter of weeks. So all these examples of what happens when government starts to change the calculus on how careful and how procedural they need to be, and what policies are and compliance systems are important versus what is important in the moment for existential issues for the public. So I'd love to get a little more into that as we talk a little more. But I think this is a good example of letting no emergency pass without taking advantage of the moment to demonstrate that things can work differently.
Yeah, there's great examples, and I think one of the things there was also your use of open source, because open source is one of the. My team always laugh at me because I have this great quote from the movie Top Gun. I feel the need for speed. Open source helps you get moving quickly, and that was really one of the things we noticed. It also means that governments can share things, and we noticed Australia and Singapore teamed up very quickly. Open source, I think, played a part in the Canadian experience as well, of sharing between governments.
It did. So a couple examples of that. Number one, one of the systems that quickly that scaled much faster than we had ever anticipated or planned is a system called GC Notify, which is a fork of the UK Notify system that's been around for about 5 or 6 years now. We had launched GC Notify just a few months before the pandemic, and had planned on a fairly gradual growth rate for it. When the pandemic hit, suddenly there were a lot of folks in government who couldn't wait a long time and go through a lot of process to get a system that would enable them to do some basic messaging to various audiences. GC Notify was there. It was ready, and we joke that we'd fork GC, we'd fork UK Notify. We had done some things to change some of the security behaviors in it. We had added bilingual support because the government of Canada works in both English and French on an equal basis. And in one of the teammates' words, we had slapped a maple leaf on it. and that was just a tremendous example of being able to move much more quickly than we otherwise would have. The other is sort of not just open source, but so the way COVID Alert came about. So Google and Apple had created the exposure notification system. Some volunteers who work at Shopify had created a scaffolding, a basic sort of some implementation stub of code to create an app and a service that would use that Google Apple exposure notification service, and then CDS and the Ontario Digital Service. Working with the Shopify folks, working with some folks in BlackBerry, working with folks at Health Canada and Ontario's Health Ministry and some other departments, were able to take the handoff of the open source code that the Shopify volunteers had written using the open API that Google and Apple had created to launch an app and a service. So yes, the speed element and the collaborative element of open source was on full display. But the other important piece of that puzzle for us was when we launched, there was never going to be any question about whether government was actually tracking. There was a lot of worry. I don't know if folks remember back in the spring of 2020, there was a lot of worry that governments were going to use these apps, these notification services, to track movements, to be invasive, privacy-wise. We had decided from the outset that working in the open, having the system be fully open source, was a really good antidote to that, because we could lay it open and say, look, anyone who wants to see exactly what code is running in this app and in this service, have at it. And we did. And technology folks took a look at it. Privacy lawyers took a look at it. And their advocacy and their endorsements were part of what made it possible for folks to have a lot of faith and trust in the system.
And move at great speed, consequently. And I think that, again, what you're saying there and showing exactly the same way that Shadi was talking about Israel is leveraging the infrastructure, and leveraging a common and clear and defined infrastructure enables you to accelerate your change programs, because you can leverage that and focus on the business that you need to do. And that's a really core part of new thinking within the public services, is that you can use that common technology to build your services on it. And that's really one of the things we've seen as an example. I mean, I might just, if possible, we talked a little bit about working from home, and I know we may even get interrupted during this by our families or during this conversation, but working from home was a massive change, because I mean, some governments, the government of Cagliari was a really good example in Italy, where being able to use workspaces to move away from the office very quickly was really powerful. Working from home in government and learning from home, I know, was a big change, and some countries did that really well, and some countries found that really difficult. Shadi, what was it like in Israel when you were thinking about learning from home and the move away from school?
Yeah, so I'll say two things. First, we also, as Aaron said, we also very, very quickly, all the government and public sector and civil servants started working from home. And I would say that there was the infrastructure and technology challenge, but that was because we had, as we mentioned before, the infrastructure, that was pretty easy. The main problem was the culture, and how do you work from home, and how do you change the way you do work, the meetings, the conversations, the brainstorm. And I think we learned a lot. We had a lot of work. We opened groups on Facebook and other, ways of communication platforms to communicate with each other and to educate managers and other people in the government how to actually do the work from home, because you want to make sure, how do you measure it? How do you put outcomes on front? So I think the cultural part was as important, and having that idea of, and learning a lot from the private sector, because, high-tech companies, other companies started working from home, or at least blended the work hybrid way before the corona. And then we learned a lot from, methodologists and things from the private sector. Going to education, I want to mention again, and it's funny that we go about reinventing. So we had a platform working a lot even before the COVID called Campus. It was based on the edX platform, which is an Harvard MIT, an NGO that developed an e-learning platform, a MOOC platform, a massive online open code platform, and open course. And then we had that platform localized to Hebrew and Arabic, in English in Israel, and having uploaded some courses even before the pandemic. But then the pandemic came, and we had to, stretch that platform for the entire education system and universities, by the way. So the result was amazing. We had hundreds of percent raised in capacity, in number of courses. If we had, 200 courses before the pandemic, we now have over 500 courses, from academic courses, because all the universities started working learning from far, but also, preparation for physics and mathematics and English, courses for kids. And we actually uploaded all that courses pretty fast. What's also interesting that we learned we should work in a hybrid way of doing it, because some of the kids came to school, some of the kids went, taught few of the days and then back home for because of need, and then how do you have all the materials like a flipped classroom? How do you have all the materials and the videos and things you need from on the platform, but having some of the discussion online in a Zoom or in other ways of communication? So how do you blend the platforms? How do you blend all the infrastructure you have to have the perfect, I wouldn't say perfect, but the best, or the best outcome, or the best class and teaching you have? And I would say it's not all success. We have to mention that. I think the last 18 months in terms of education there was a lot of good things that happened, and a lot of learning, and a lot of advance in technology and online learning and courses. There are some disadvantages, of course, and from social interactions and other things. So I want to make sure we're not painting a very too nice picture of what happened in the last 2 years. But I think in terms of education, the platform we had, and just to summarize, the platform we upload the courses, we could scale it very fast and very quickly. It was all in the cloud, of course, and that allowed us to have the magnitude to using 2 million students, maybe more, in a real time, just scale it up and work with the courses.
And it was really transformative, the experience. One of the most reformist leaders I met during the pandemic was the Minister Shawki in Egypt, when they also went through the same thing and moved on to a remote platform. Not everything worked. Not everything was great. You had to learn new ways and doing things differently. But it means you can start to reinvent your entire organization at that point. And particularly, some of the things that we talked about was about building actually a university for Africa. Was one of the things that came into their mind, because they had seen the opportunity of building and scaling, using common approaches and technology. I thought it might be an idea. As you can probably tell from my accent, I come from the United Kingdom, and I worked in government there. One of the things that I found really fascinating, having left government, was that the plans and the programs that ran for the pandemic were, again, at a very big scale. One of them, the coronavirus job retention scheme, which was rather like the example Aaron used of helping people move on to and support and use the furlough and all of those components. That actually worked at massive scale very, very quickly. It was really important that it worked and people trusted it to work. And that was one of the great things where the cloud and AWS Cloud helped people build in that sense. Another one, just to give you a size of this idea about the scale of it, the Department of Work and Pensions, which is the main benefits agency in the UK, their change was, their requirements changed. They had 10 times as much traffic as they'd had before. And if you just think about what that meant, they were running 8 MongoDB clusters over 3 availability zones. Their entire business went up tenfold in that period. And it meant that they had to work really, really hard at making sure the scale worked. Well, the great thing about that was that by using the cloud, by using that common structure, common infrastructure a well-architected approach, having built their services around microservices, it meant that they were able to leverage the heavy lifting of infrastructure and run and build and change the services effectively. And it didn't go down. It was a really great example of success in that space. And one other, because we don't want to focus too much on particular areas, the really huge change we saw also was in India. And this is just one example from India. Arogya-Sri, this is an app which was built for a healthcare trust, an insurance service. The scalability for that was absolutely crucial, because people, once you started something, as we said earlier, the scalability that you need to have to run a service and the visibility of that to citizens became an order of magnitude difference. So that ability to trust the government relied on things working, and the things would work if they were able to scale. It also meant the security was a really important component of that. And I think that although this example, which was 20 apps in total and 47 terabytes of patient and citizen data, meant that the scale it needed to work at was and the speed in which they had to scale up was far in excess of anything that they'd expected. It was a really, really interesting way of seeing something launch quickly, effectively, and in many ways got to work first time. And that was where the cloud really came into its own and helped people move. And just another couple of examples just to talk through about that. One of which was Connect and being able to launch call center services really quickly. Was transformative in many people's response to the pandemic. And then going back to thinking about working from home and how workspaces help people build and move away from their office and use the, let's be honest, sometimes very old-fashioned services that had been in their office that hadn't been modernized, hadn't been migrated. The ability for that to work with workspaces was a tremendous change, which enabled government to keep going in the very dark days of March, April, May 2020. It was a really, really big change, but it was also a big change, where people who had committed to the technology that could scale were able to do that. But that does lead me to think, and just moving on slightly, that people now expect the world to work differently. And they expect governments are going to go this fast and be able to support the new normal. Aaron, the world looks very different now. How are we going to go back to pre-COVID patterns of work? I mean, surely we should just go back to where we were.
Oh boy. Yeah, well, so I think that's the key question, right? The key question is whether we're going to learn, the right lessons or the wrong ones come out of this, right? So to a certain extent, the bell has been rung. You can't unring it. Clearly, there are changes that are here to stay. I think one obvious one is that governments that attempt to make people come back to work full-time in the office every day, even though clearly they were able to do their jobs effectively, sometimes even much more so remotely, are going to be suffering even more than they already do with the competitive job market and hiring the people that they want to be able to hire and retaining the people they want to be able to retain. I think that's just going to be a fact of life moving forward. The question about whether some of the deeper cultural changes will stick or get rolled back like a bad check-in. The Canadian Emergency Relief Benefit brought something into really sharp relief for me because they were able to do it so the question is, why were they able to do it so quickly when there are some other, so just as a counterexample, CDS, the Canadian Digital Service, the team that I was leading for a while in Canada, had been working with another department on a benefit that required a 25-page application followed by a physician attestation, and then typically took 4 months on average to adjudicate. And then half the time when you got your adjudication from your application, the result was your application was incomplete or in error somehow. And so a lot of folks waiting on a benefit that's important to them through a lot of process. And the question is why? Well, there's all these rules in place to make sure that no money ever goes out that shouldn't go out, because you don't want anybody ever getting a cent that they're not absolutely supposed to have according to the policy and the regs and the laws. Now compare that to, say, the private disability insurance market, where you apply for disability insurance and you're going to get an adjudication, you're going to get a yes or no from a private insurer in like 48 hours. And the reason that they can do that in 48 hours instead of 4 months is that those companies have a certain tolerance for fraud and abuse and waste, right? They know that they will go and chase down a lot of that kind of stuff ex post instead of trying to enforce it in great detail and with a lot of apparatus ex ante. Whereas government doesn't do that. Now, come to the emergency relief benefit in the spring of 2020. All of that money pouring out into people's hands. And there were questions raised here and there about, well, wait, is everybody getting money, supposed to be getting that money? And are some people getting more money than they're supposed to, or getting money when they're not supposed to at all? And the answer was almost certainly yes. But the response from government was interesting, I think, because the response was essentially, look, we're at a moment where if we try to play that game, we're not going to get this money into people's hands quickly enough, and we're not going to keep our economy afloat. So we are going to live with that. And guess what? We have all this mechanism, we have apparatus to go and claw back money if we gave away too much later, or to write it off, right? We have in fact a tax system where, look, if we calculate later that we gave you too much, we will take it out of your taxes next year. Or we will do some sort of negotiation. We will write a certain amount of it off, because that was the risk versus benefit calculus at the moment. Now the question is, even though the moment has passed where everything feels existential and emergent, do we continue to start to think that way about programs? Do we start to say, look, it is in the user's need, right, not to waste all this time and all this money being super, super careful about a relatively small percentage of the dollars that we're talking about, or the program benefits that we're talking about? Do we want to change that balance and think more like the way CERB worked and less like the way some other programs have worked in the past, in order to make a more user-friendly experience, an experience that helps people faster and better? Is government willing to think that way? Or are they still going to be afraid of the headline that somebody got $100 that they weren't supposed to get?
But I think, Aaron, also on top of that, and that's a really great example of where the technology and the culture are changing, is you within government for the first time, because you're able to leverage really strong capabilities, for example, in analysis and understanding the data lake and understanding the data that's in there, and being able to understand people's behavior and modeling that through their use of services. You're actually in a position there as government to take those policy decisions where you're saying, well, actually, we think it should be at a 6 this year, and it might move to a 5 next year, and you can change the way that you're delivering policy and the way that you're delivering services, because you're able to understand the data. And you're able to understand the data because you're using an architecture which actually enables you to see it. I know it sounds really basic, but for years, government has worked on the way that you would pull a lever and everything would go in one particular way. And this is where Universal Credit, as an example, great example, David, of that program, or the example you were using there, means that government can start to change the locus of decision to be more about, do I meet the user need now, rather than do I have to build something for everybody and it stay fixed?
A friend of ours said that in the digital world, delivery informs policy, right? And part of the reason delivery informs policy is because we can move so much more quickly with delivery when we have the infrastructure and the platform and the tools that we have now. And part of it is that delivery is creating sets of data that are beyond anything we've had before. And we can be more precise and expansive about the analysis to inform and to crunch that data and make use of it very, very quickly.
Yeah, and that's the real difference, isn't it? That you can actually start to leverage common platforms, common technology that you've organized and built in the right way to build things that can change on the fly. And that's a radical change to the way of delivering government. Shaili, if we look at Israel and where you're what you've learned, and obviously, I mean, Israel led the world at the beginning with the vaccination program, and you've gone through the booster program now, and you've gone through people working from home, people teaching from home. What's next in Israel? What do you see as the next big change that's going to come through, and that we can see building that's going to leverage our experience from this crisis?
Wow, that's a big question. First, I'm not sure we are over this crisis yet. I don't know about wave 5, 6, and 7. Hopefully not. And even with all the learning we had, we did miss wave 4. I think it was a combination of the Delta coming in and the lowering effect of the vaccination before the booster. And we were a bit slow in identifying that. And then we got hit with the wave 4. Now with the booster, we are back on track. And hopefully other countries, and I know the UK and other countries are now learning from our experience. So we had the data, but we still, kind of missed it out. So I'm not sure we're over the crisis, but I think, and I want to even comment, I agree with Aaron and you totally. I think it also, what changes is the question of trust. Trusting the platforms, trusting the services, trusting the government, doing online. And I think that's a big change because of the acceleration of a lot of the services and a lot of the processes and a lot of, government interactions with the public, because we had to accelerate everything. And it became the standard of working from remote or working digitally, not working just doing the work, but also having government services from remote and, having everything, all the access and everything. I think that acceleration changed something in the relationship and the trust contract between the government and the public. And I think now it will be easier. I don't know if it's going to stay the way it is. Probably there will be, some effect going back. I'm not sure it's, all going to stick like that. But I think that the change, the cultural change, the trust, the mind, the understanding of, this is the way we're going forward. I think that's a big change that hopefully will stay. And the next big challenge is, it's always about data. I think it's the next, we didn't figure out yet all that, how using big data and, and analysis, Aaron mentioned, to better, first in government work, first we just had the basic data just to make better and informed decisions. But now we are learning from, using AI and big data and machine learning and all of that. Now we are, more greedy. We're not, it's not sufficient enough just using, having like dashboards. 5, 6 years ago, dashboards were, for government dashboards were, were innovation. These days, we want to have a personalized, differentiated decision makings and government work and automation and all that using data and big data that we're getting from, from the public and from other places and all that thing. So I think we still didn't figure it out completely, and this is the big challenge. Now that we know that we can, and we used big data, and we used, as I mentioned, AI and machine learning for how to, to deploy vaccination and how to identify where we're going to have like COVID outbreaks. So we use that data, and we saw that it's, we are using the big, we had a lot of data, the big data to making better decision making, real time, on demand, at the same day or few days before. So now we are, now we want to use that to other areas. The same way we worked, the same data lakes, the same, work we've done, access to data, synthetic data, working with privacy and security, of course, that's important. But, how can we leverage that to other areas of life post-COVID? So in terms of employment, which is now a big issue, and unemployment, in terms of education, in terms of, social welfare, in terms of, infrastructure. How do you use all that knowledge and skills and capabilities that we built very fast in the last 18 months in a crisis mode? How do you leverage that to other ways of life? So I think for me, this is the biggest challenge of the government in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think that's it, is that how do we get into that process of leveraging the common resources so that you can move faster and faster with building services using common capabilities and using capabilities which, as you said, with startups, it's much easier to bring in those capabilities and bring in new services quickly. One thing I know I always rabbit on about identity, but I think the other thing which is coming through is this idea around identity and change. You said something very important in the answer there, which was about changing the relationship between the citizen and the state. And I think identity is one of those areas where that's going to change as well a bit more. People have COVID passes now. people have the requirement to demonstrate their health in a way we've never done before, I can sense that identity becomes an important component. And you know, who I showed an example from India earlier, but the amazing progress of the India stack and the capability to leverage a common identity capability has really shown how you can start to accelerate not just efficient government, but smoother and more effective industry as well. And I think from my point of view, I think that's going to be one of the changes which is going to seep through over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, is the real change to the way people think about identity and the state in that environment. I talked a little bit about momentum, and momentum was always a very key part. When I remember when, Charlie, when you set up Digital Israel and started to get things moving, there was one of the core components of it when we started talking about it was it's got to keep going. We've got to have momentum. And Aaron, in a similar way, you know, you set up the Canadian Digital Service, you got it moving, you got the momentum, you moved on from it now just recently. But both of you were great practitioners of momentum for reform. And I wonder how, if we think about this, and we're coming to the end of our session, but the ability to keep going and the ability to keep driving forward reform and technology-based reform is difficult, because you can't have a new thing every day. And how do you and what was your secret to driving reform forward and keeping technology current? Aaron, if we go to you.
There's lots to, of course, there's a whole session just on that, Liam, right? In fact, like a whole evening of drinks, I think. But, you know, a couple things that come to mind immediately. One is, I think at these digital teams, these digital service teams at the beginning and for the first, I don't know how many years, need to be adaptable enough to be opportunistic, to be able to jump on the moment when the moment arises, and not just a sudden public need necessarily, but it's the intersection of that and also just how much a particular team or group of teams inside that institution is ready for as the next, right? So like jumping way too far out is often a recipe for failure. I mean, it's great to like create a shiny example of something, but you're probably not bringing folks along, right? So because as you noted, like a lot of this is about capability and readiness inside a large old institution with a lot of set ways, and so. And those ways don't change overnight, as we know. Just like the infrastructure doesn't change overnight, neither does any of the culture, which is the topic here. And so figuring out how you can make those stepwise changes that eventually will look like cultural transformation, but are in fact a series of small steps along the way, right? Figuring out what folks are ready for and what you're capable of delivering is super important. I mean, obviously it begins with having a very capable team, a team that's capable of the technology and also capable of understanding how to bring folks along in that sort of in that sort of setting.
I want to add two things. First, we are very lucky that we chose an area there's always innovation. We never end. Our work is never ending. We are very lucky in that because we will always chase technology. We will always chase progress. The private sector will always be 2 steps ahead of us, and government will keep updating. And I think we should understand that if we want to, keep up to date and on top of things, we have to keep changing and keep moving. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think what COVID taught us is that we need to be ready. Today was a pandemic, and hopefully not, but in 2 years it will be, climate change or other crises. Things will come, and government needs to be ready. And the way to be ready is by having the right infrastructure of technology infrastructure and cloud and the right people and the right culture to be able to face the crises that will come ahead. And they will come. It will be different in maybe each country. It will not always be a global one. But the fact that we are ready, we are flexible, we adapt, we can scale, we can react to things that will come for the government, that's only by having, a very good infrastructure, a very good teams on board that you're able to, leverage or change or adapt as it needed. And I think if we stay behind and not keep moving and keep changing and keep innovating, we will not be ready for the next crisis. And if the one thing we need to learn from the pandemic is that we need to be ready, and all governments needs to be ready. And the government that were more ready dealt better with the pandemic. So I think this is a flag or a call for a wake-up call for everyone to work on this infrastructure, because that's the only way to make sure that in the next 5 to 10 years we'll be ready for everything that will come to us.
Charlie, that's really, really important, and thank you very much. That's a really good summary, I think, of where we've got to and what we've learned. And thank you so much. I mean, we're at reInvent, which is, as I said before, I mean, it's a conference about technology. It's always our great new developments. But what you've talked about today is how you can use and leverage those changes in a way that helps you deliver with speed, because governments need to work at massive speed now. Everyone relies on them. Everyone turns around and focuses on them. At scale, because government is for everybody. So there's no market segmentation here. You have to build things that work for everybody. And also how you work and earn trust, and earn the trust of your citizens so that they can work with you and rely on government and rely on the public services to help them through the change. And it's been 20, 30 months now of really amazing change, but we've learned so much from it. And I'm so grateful for you two for taking us through what it was like to be in the hot seat, what it was like to identify those changes, but also what the key things you realized were that helped you leverage and helped you drive faster the reforms and the changes that were so apparent as we went through a crisis I hope we'll never have to go through again. So thank you so much. It's been an amazing tour de force from you of what happened in real life in a real example situation. And I hope that our colleagues have taken something from this now of what all of that technology, all of those capabilities that you can use can be put together to change the relationship, as you said, Charlie, change the relationship between the citizen and the state. You can't get more important than that. So thank you so much. It's been lovely to have you.